On the borders of a dark forest, far away, there once lived a woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The woodcutter was very poor indeed, and the children, who were called Hansel and Gretel, had often not had enough bread to eat. Their mother had died when they were very little, and the woodcutter's new wife did not care for children. So times were hard for Hansel and Gretel. As winter came on, they grew poorer and poorer, until at last one night the poor woodcutter said to his wife, "What are we to do? There's only one loaf of bread left, and I fear we shall starve." "We must get rid of the children," answered his wife. "Tomorrow we will take them into the woods and leave them there. They will never be able to find their way home." "Oh, no," said the father. "I could not leave them there to starve." "Well, we shall starve altogether if they stay with us," answered his wife. "So it will come to the same thing in the end." And she talked to her husband until she made him promise to do as she had said. Now, although it was late, Hansel and Gretel were wide awake, for they were too hungry to sleep, and they could not help hearing all the plans that were made. "Oh," sobbed Gretel, "we shall be lost in the dark wood, and the wild beasts will eat us." "Oh, do not cry, little sister," said Hansel. "I will take care of you." Then he softly unbarred the door and stepped out on the garden path. The moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles on the path shone like new pennies. Hansel stooped down and filled his pockets with as many pebbles as he could hold, and then he went in and crept back into bed again. The next morning the wife came and woke the children very early. She told them they must get up and dress themselves quickly. "You shall go with us to the forest today while your father cuts wood," she said. And then she gave them each a thick slice of bread for their dinner, and they all set out together. Gretel carried both slices of bread in her apron, for Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. Now as they went along, the father noticed that Hansel stopped and looked back every few minutes. "Why do you look back so often, my son?" he asked. "If you do not take care, you will stumble and fall." "I only look back to see my little white cat, who's sitting on the roof," answered Hansel. "She wants to say goodbye to me." "Nonsense," cried the woodcutter's wife. "There is no cat. It's only the morning sun shining on the wet roof." But Hansel was not really looking at the cat, for each time he turned around, he dropped a white pebble on the road to mark the way in which they were taking. As they went farther and farther into the wood, it grew more and more difficult. At last, the woodcutter stopped and told the children to gather some sticks and make them into a heap. "I'm going to light a fire to warm you," he said, "and then you can rest here until I return." So Hansel and Gretel sat down and warmed themselves at the fire and ate their slices of bread quite happily, for they thought they heard their father chopping wood close by. But the sound they heard was only the dead branch of a tree swinging in the wind. Feeling very tired after their long walk, they curled themselves up on the dry leaves and fell fast asleep. When they awoke, it was quite dark, and the fire was out. The only sound they heard was the hooting of the owls overhead. "Oh, Hansel, what shall we do?" sobbed Gretel. "We're lost in the wood, and we shall never be able to find our way home." "Only wait until the moon rises, little sister. Give me your hand, and I will take you safely home." And when the moon began to rise and send silver moonbeams to light up the dark forest, the children set out, hand in hand, and found the white pebbles shining like little lamps all the way to the cottage. "You bad children!" cried the woodcutter's wife when she opened the door to let them in. "We thought you were never coming home." But their father took them up in his arms and kissed them over and over again in his joy, for he had been afraid that he would never see them again. Not long after this, there came a day when there was only half a loaf of bread left in the little hut. The wife said to her husband, "We are even poorer than we were before. Must we all starve together, or shall we take the children once more to the forest, where they cannot possibly find their way home?" The woodcutter was very unhappy at the thought, but because he had once said yes, it was now twice as difficult to say no. The children lay trembling in their beds as they listened to these plans. The poor little Gretel was terribly frightened, but Hansel comforted her and slipped out of bed to fill his pockets with the white pebbles. This time, however, the door was locked and barred. Hansel could not get out, and he had to creep back to bed again and think of some other plan. "Come, get up, you lazy children," cried the wife next morning. "You're going to the forest with us today. Here's your dinner." And she gave them 2 small slices of bread. Gretel put her slice into her pocket, but Hansel crumbled his into small pieces, and these he dropped along the way as he had done with the pebbles. "What are you turning around to look at?" asked the woman. "Be quick, and do not linger." "I was only saying goodbye to my white pigeon who's sitting on the roof," said Hansel. "Nonsense!" cried the woman. "There is no pigeon. It's only the morning sun shining on the wet roof." But she did not see that every time Hansel stopped to look back, he dropped a crumb to mark the way. This time they went much farther into the heart of the wood. When the children were tired, their father told them to gather wood so he could make a fire. "And you can rest until we come back," he said. So they rested by the fire, and Gretel shared her slice of bread with Hansel. Then they grew so tired of waiting for their father, they fell fast asleep. It was quite dark when they woke Gretel. She was sure there was wild beasts prowling about ready to eat them up, but Hansel was quite brave. "I will take care of you, little sister," he said, "and I can easily find my way home, for I marked the road with my breadcrumbs." But alas, the birds had eaten up every crumb, and there was not one left to show them the way home. Still they wandered on and on, all that night and all next day, but they only seemed to get deeper and deeper into the forest. They had nothing to eat but a few berries, which they found in the wood. When the 3rd day dawned, they were nearly starving. "Oh, Hansel," said Gretel, "I think we shall be obliged to eat the fairy toadstools." But Hansel held her hand tight and led her on. Suddenly, they saw a beautiful bird sitting on the branch of a tree overhead. It sang so sweetly that the children stopped to listen to it. When it spread its great fluttering wings and flew off, they ran after it as quickly as they could. It seemed to know that the children were following, for it circled slowly in front of them until it stopped over a tiny cottage in the heart of the wood. And when the children came near, they found it was the most wonderful cottage they had ever seen. It was built entirely of gingerbread and with cookies for ornaments. The windows were made of transparent candy, and the steps of toffee. "What a feast we shall have!" cried Hansel, standing on tiptoe to break off a piece of the overhanging gingerbread roof. "Help yourself to a pane of candy, little sister, or a step of toffee." Gretel took a piece of gingerbread in one hand and a pane of hard candy in the other, and sat down on a toffee step to enjoy herself. And as they were both eating, they heard a gentle voice from the inside of the cottage. "Munching and crunching, do I hear a mouse? Eating the walls of my gingerbread house?" But the children answered quickly, "'Tis only the wind you mistake for a mouse, and no one is eating your gingerbread house." Then, as the children went on eating, the cottage door opened, and an old woman hobbled out. Hansel dropped his square of gingerbread, and Gretel paused with a mouthful of candy. They were both so frightened they could not move. "Dear little children, do not be afraid of me. You are welcome to eat as much of my house as you like. But come inside, and I will give you a nice dinner." Then she led the children in and fed them on pancakes and apple tarts and cream. The children felt as if they were in heaven. She had red eyes which didn't see very far, but she could smell things as quickly as a fox, and she knew when Hansel and Gretel were wandering in the forest, she had built the gingerbread house just to catch them. Early next morning, the old witch went in to look at the sleeping children. She rubbed her withered old hands with glee when she saw how tender and fresh they looked. She would have liked them to be plumper, but that was easily mended. So she seized Hansel with her bony hand, and before he was half awake, she thrust him into a little iron cage and fastened the grating in front. And then she shook Gretel roughly by the shoulder. "Get up, you lazy little girl. You must light the fire and fill a big pot with water and help me to make the breakfast, for I have shut your brother up in a cage, and I'm going to fatten him until he's plump enough to cook for my supper." So poor little Gretel was obliged to do as the old witch had directed. And while Hansel was fed on the choicest of candies and cookies and ice cream, she had only had to eat were crumbs. And every day the old witch would go into the little iron cage and say to Hansel, "Little boy, put out your finger that I may see how fat you are growing." Hansel knew that she could not see with her red eyes, so he poked out a bone instead of his finger, and every day when she felt it, she grumbled fearfully because he never seemed to grow fatter. At last she could wait no longer, and she said to Gretel, "You must get up very early tomorrow morning, for there is plenty of work for you to do. I'm going to cook your brother for dinner. You must light the fire, heat the oven, and help me prepare for the feast." Poor Gretel cried as if her heart would break. "Oh, how I wish we had starved together in the wood or been eaten up by the wild beasts. Anything would have been better than this." "Wishing will not do you much good," said the wicked old witch, blinking her red eyes with glee. "And stop those foolish tears, or you will put the fire out." Gretel went about with a very heavy heart the next day as she lit the fire and filled a big pot with water and heated the great stone oven. And when it was ready, the old witch called to her and said, "I have kneaded the dough, and the loaves are ready for baking. Come, little girl, creep into the oven and tell me if it's hot enough." Now the old witch meant to shut the oven door as soon as the child was inside and bake her for dinner instead of the bread. But Gretel guessed what she meant to do. "The door is too small, and I don't know how to get in." "What nonsense," answered the witch. "See, it's quite big enough." And she put her head in first like this, and the old witch stooped down and poked her head inside the oven. Quick as she could, Gretel ran behind and with all her might gave a sudden push, so that the old witch went headlong into the oven. Gretel banged the door shut and fastened it securely. Then she found the key of Hansel's cage and ran quickly to let him out. "The old witch is safe in the oven," she cried, and they threw their arms around each other and danced for joy. After that they went into the cottage and opened all the witch's treasure chests. Hansel filled his pockets with pearls and diamonds and rubies, while Gretel took as many jewels as her little apron would hold. Then, hand in hand, they set out once more to try to find their way home, and very glad they were to leave the witch's cottage behind. They had not gone far through the wood when they came to a great lake, so broad that it would be impossible to cross it without a boat. "What shall we do?" said Hansel. "There's no bridge, and I can see no boat to carry us over." "Look, Hansel, out in the middle of the lake, there's a duck. Maybe the duck will give us a ride to the other side." And sure enough, the duck came over and was quite obliging and helped them both to get to the other side of the shore. And when they stood together on the opposite shore of the lake, they found to their joy that it was a part of the wood which they knew quite well. They ran along quickly, and at the next turning they came in sight of their own little hut, and saw their fathers. The poor woodcutter was overjoyed when the children rushed into his arms. He had never known a moment's happiness since he had left the children in the wood, and now he was all alone, for his wife had died. He held the children in his arms and cried for joy. They told him all about the adventures and how they had escaped from the wicked witch. "And see what we've brought home," said Gretel, opening her apron and showing her glittering jewels. "And look how full my pockets are," said Hansel, turning them out until the floor was covered with precious stones. And now they had riches enough to last them all their days, and they would never be hungry again. But though the diamonds and rubies were very precious, Hansel and Gretel thought they were not half as beautiful as the little white pebbles on the garden walk, which shone brightly when the moon came out and bathed them in silver light. And that's the end of the story of Hansel and Gretel.